All right, so we'll transition now over to Jeff Stark, and Jeff, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. So good afternoon. My name is Jeff Stark. I'm the Principal Security Engineer at MegaplanIT, and I oversee our Security Operations Center. So for those of you, Mark, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I think the About Us, yeah. So who is MegaplanIT? For anyone who's not aware, we are a network security compliance firm. We're based out of Scottsdale, Arizona, and we offer over 44 professional services. Everything we do falls under one of three overarching branches of service. So we have a compliance branch, security testing, and our managed security services. Really, we strive to form partnerships with our clients, and we aim to work hand in hand with our clients' compliance and end resolution teams. So I want to talk a little bit about the different types of vulnerabilities that we're going to see. Really, they are going to fall into one of two different categories. The first category of vulnerabilities may be due to an inherent flaw in a service or application. These vulnerabilities are typically identified and addressed by the vendor in pretty short amount of time through issuing a security patch. These are probably the things that first kind of come to mind when you're thinking about a remediation. We're putting together a whole process around this. Unfortunately, not all vulnerabilities can be patched. In some cases, we're provided with mitigation guidance, which may include workarounds to prevent exploitation, or might just decrease the likelihood of it being exploited in the wild. Really, regardless, it's important to tie your vulnerability scanning reporting to your patching and remediation efforts. If internally you don't take the steps to integrate these two efforts, you're significantly increasing the chances that a critical vulnerability will be overlooked. The second category of vulnerabilities is due to system configuration errors. So these are the cases where service and applications are built and are running securely. However, problems in their implementation make them susceptible to being misused. So when we're looking at the vulnerability results that we get, how are we going to prioritize the information presented to us? So if you guys are running any sort of internal vulnerability management lifecycle, then you guys are well aware that your typical vulnerability scan, even with a broken up scope, you're running maybe distributed scanning on different network segments, you're still going to get very, very long vulnerability reports. So we need to be able to prioritize those vulnerabilities when they're identified and triage that and hit the most critical first. So we need to understand our system risk. You need to know what assets are critical to your organization's business function. You need to maintain this information in the list and keep it up to date. These are the obvious things like your domain controllers and firewalls, but also the less obvious, like the critical backend servers that, if taken offline for a period of time, would bring a screeching halt to the business. Obviously, there's a scale to these things, and the important thing to note is that you should be aware of what that scale is. Those assets are what make the money at the end of the day, and they need to be kept in as secure of state as humanly possible. When the vulnerability information is released, so more recently released vulnerabilities are also more likely to be available, and hackers are more likely to target these vulnerabilities. When you think about it, a vulnerability that's been around for several years, while potentially just as critical and harming to your environment, is far less likely to appear as something that has just come out within the past couple days. If hackers can get ahead of that curve and hit those systems before they're patched, then they're going to significantly increase their chances of being successful. This is why it's important that you keep on top of these vulnerabilities as they're released and ensure your vulnerability database is always kept up to date. So how many systems are impacted? They always say that there is no silver bullet in security, and that's definitely true. But addressing high impact vulnerabilities is kind of the next best thing. So when you're looking at these vulnerability reports, when you have a vulnerability that impacts, say, even 20% of your environment, maybe even more than that, when you're able to go through and remediate that, either through a patch or through changing the configuration or mitigation, it definitely feels as close to a silver bullet kind of moment as you can possibly get. You need to consider, is there an available patch? So it's important to know whether or not something can be patched or if only mitigation guidance is available. And this is something that you need to kind of factor into your internal prioritization. There's a lot of solutions out there. Pretty much everything tries to assign a priority. Usually this will be kind of a combination of a CVSS-based score, which is, how likely is something to be exploited? Are exploits available? Is it publicly accessible? What level of permission does somebody need? And all that kind of factors in. But at the same time, like that's kind of the guideline, right? That's what's being provided from the vendor. When you're analyzing these things yourselves, you need to actually take your asset criticality. That could immediately make something that's a much lower priority something much higher. But in this instance, we need to think, if there's an available patch and we have a patching process, we know that's going to roll out over the course of the next week. That might not be as high of a concern as something where we need to script out a custom mitigation and then push this out. That might take more time. It might be a more, create a more critical issue, but we just need to be able to track on these things, be aware, and include that in how we're prioritizing these risks. Can the impacted service be disabled? So this one's really straightforward. If you don't need it, you may be able to disable the service outright. Obviously this isn't going to work for applications. Typically, you're going to be using a majority of the applications, but I've seen it before where on a vulnerability scan, we identified some application, some particular piece of software that was vulnerable. And, the end service team kind of came back and said, we haven't used that in the past 2 years. So those ones are really easy. Let's clear that stuff up, uninstall, wipe that stuff out, or disable where we can to reduce our ultimate surface area of attack. And then will patching adversely impact operations? So this is really a common issue that often gets overlooked, especially with small, medium businesses, is why you really need to have a testing environment, especially when you're running any kind of custom application. If you don't have a test environment where you're also testing your patches prior to production rollout, we do highly suggest you build one out. It's kind of more best practice, larger organizations, that's kind of their bread and butter. They're not just using that test environment to test out new features and new capabilities. They're looking at even just base operating system level patching and remediation. They're doing all of that like a week before in their test environment before rolling it out to the production. So if you don't have that process in place today, we definitely recommend you look into kind of building that one out a little more. And finally, we have some considerations for when you're working with cloud services. Some of the important things about cloud are really easily overlooked. Cloud, it's been around for quite some time now, but it's still, shocking to me how a lot of these things get overlooked. So you need to keep in mind that traditional network-based vulnerability assessments may not be practical, necessary, or allowed without prior consent by your cloud provider. Anybody who's ever tried to do a vulnerability assessment against AWS is definitely aware of this. You have to get prior consent before you kick off any sort of scan against them. I want to say, I'm not remembering off the top of my head because I know there was just a change to this in the past 6 months. I think they have gotten a little bit more permissible about it, but every cloud vendor is going to be a little bit different. You need to be aware of what those policies are. And just understand that, you're not going to be able to take the same mentality of an on-premise network and how you were scanning and doing, the older types of vulnerability assessment and just think that that's going to immediately carry over to the cloud, because it is a little different. Instances may not persist long enough for authenticated scanning, or the host may not be accessible due to how cloud services are presented. This is a primary use case for installing agent-based vulnerability scanners, such as what InsightVM can provide, which they'll discuss a little bit more in detail later on. Containerized applications can also not be assessed in the same way as traditional networking infrastructure. So they're going to require special configuration or special kinds of connectors. The easiest solution to these problems is using an agent-based vulnerability scanning solution with the ability to integrate with containers and your cloud provider's infrastructure. Fortunately, InsightVM is able to provide all of these capabilities. Now, I do have a couple kind of more posed as challenge questions. These are more just to get people thinking about, what do you have in place today? I was impressed with the metric saying that, around, what was it, Mark, I think like 60%, 65% respondents said they did have a dedicated full-time individual for their.
Yeah, 65%.
Yeah, no, that's awesome to hear. I always like seeing metrics like that and understand a little bit more around how some of the client environments are working. And, we exist more to augment and, build upon your existing teams with our managed security services. So we do the full suite of security monitoring, detection, network detection, host-based detection. We'll manage EDR solutions, and then the vulnerability scanning is kind of the main focus of our talking points today. But so we, really kind of just come in, help augment in whatever areas you guys might be kind of lacking in. So it's great to hear that you guys have a lot of, dedicated vulnerability analysts. The challenge questions that I like to go through, I've got 1 through 8, and I'll just run through real quick. First one, just to get you thinking, is do you have someone internally who can fully commit as a vulnerability analyst? So I think we've got the answer to that for the most part, which is good to see. Would you have the budget and approval to get that individual trained? So this kind of calls into consideration, okay, even if you do have a dedicated person for this, have they received the relevant and specific training that they would need to work with the specific tool that you have deployed currently? And are we keeping them up to date on that? I know a lot of times that comes back to, funding, and that's a whole nother argument to get into, but just things to consider. 3 would be, would your vulnerability analyst have unrestricted access to a compliance advisor? So one of the benefits with us is that because we have the different branches where we have compliance and we have our security testing, we have the managed security services, is that if we have a client question come in where we shared their vulnerability results with them, and they weren't sure necessarily how to address it, and it kind of impacts their compliance, we can go directly across our own office and we can go talk to a compliance specialist, figure out what is the best case solution for their specific need, and then turn around same day and be able to give them that level of guidance. I know in the compliance part of it's a whole nother discussion, but the other question would be, do you have someone dedicated full-time internally for compliance? A lot of bigger organizations will have a compliance officer, and that's all they do. That's their bread and butter, right? So if you do have something like that internal and they're talking with your vulnerability analyst, awesome. That's like best case scenario. For the organizations that don't, or are looking to, again, like I said, kind of augment those kinds of capabilities, that's really what we're here for and what we're able to provide. Could your security practice endure the loss of that individual? And this doesn't necessarily have to be the worst case scenario. It could be, they got sick, they had an injury, they had a family issue that just moved them across the country. If these kinds of things happen, they're unfortunate, but would your current security practice be able to continue, or how would it be impacted if that person were to leave? Would your organization be able to fill that open position within 30 days? And does your security monitoring team have access to your vulnerability data? So this is moving away from the compliance and just looking at the 24/7 monitoring. Does the team that's looking at the inbound exploits, all of the attacks against your infrastructure, do they have access to your vulnerability data? Because that's the first thing they're going to want to validate against. If I see some sort of WordPress exploit coming in and you're not running WordPress anywhere in your environment, then that's going to be a pretty quick false positive. Whereas, if you are, and I'm able to validate that, and I'm able to make that link, that correlation, that I'm seeing WordPress exploits against a WordPress host, using that just as a very general example, that's important to be able to make those correlations and have that information available to those teams. Does your security team currently track on historical vulnerability information? So this is something that we do for our clients, where when we're producing our vulnerability reports, we're also building out just a whole history of anything that the clients ever come to us and they've said, hey, this is a false positive. This is kind of one of the most common complaints I hear about a lot of other vulnerability services that are out there, is that, no matter how times they complain back and say, hey, we have an exemption for this, we have a mitigation for this, we don't want to see this on our vulnerability reports, the producer of the reports will just keep putting that on there and forwarding it out month after month, and I'm sure it's part of a more automated process. So we track on all that information historically internally, and then we're able to make sure that once you report something back to us like that, you're never going to see that again on a report moving forward. And then finally, is your security currently ensuring at least quarterly internal and external scanning? So it's awesome if you're doing more than quarterly. For a lot of the different services out there, such as PCI, then you're required to do at least quarterly. We will typically set our clients up on monthly. But for anybody who has managed some sort of program like this before, it seems really easy. Like you can just schedule some of these tasks and, you're off to the races. Reality is a lot of times when you go to run those scans, there's bound to be problems. Either those credentials aren't necessarily going to work everywhere that they're supposed to if you're trying to run some sort of authenticated scanning, or, you know, there might be firewall implications, or I've seen it before where the scan didn't actually kick off when it was supposed to. And so we have 24/7 support that's going to be watching those scans as they're kicking off and following up with those immediately, versus, you know, you go through a whole approval process, you get like this window set up, you go to run your scan, and then you find out the next day it didn't work, and you're kind of back to square one and have to set all of that back up again. So, you know, really just a lot of talking points to kind of get you guys thinking about, you know, kind of increased reliability, you know, the different kinds of service components that kind of integrate, and how everything can kind of build itself up. And, you know, ultimately kind of some of the major roadblocks that I think a lot of people run into kind of across implementing various vulnerability remediation strategies. But with that, I'd like to actually, Mark, do you want me to turn it directly over to Greg, or you want me to kick it back over to you?
That's great. Yeah, we'll if you're finished, we'll go ahead and transition over to Greg and then go from there.
Okay, awesome. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Greg with Rapid7 for their technical demo.
Hey, Greg here. Yeah, that was awesome, Jeff. Really thanks for a lot of those talking points that conveniently curtails into subjects I love talking about. Let's see. Would you mind killing your screen share?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I spent time in the Air Force as a cyber attack officer, and what's funny about that is that in the line of work that I'm in, a lot of people say, well, that's awesome. You bring the attacker mindset to threat exposure management, which of course is true to a degree. But what I think the major benefit of the Air Force experience was a process, procedure, and kind of best practice, because you're dealing with so many engagements, in my case, attack engagements, but assets that you're interacting with is a nice way to put it, that everything that you do is considered a big data problem, and you need to think about ways to reduce the human effort required. And I think that that's increasingly true in threat exposure management and vuln management. And being a robotics guy before that, my guilt has always been over automation as opposed to under automation. And one of the things that I really love about the Rapid7 stance on these particular questions is that we build them into the tool. And I think I wouldn't say scripting is a bygone era at all. There's still a lot of value in being able to script, especially as an end executor and implementer of actions in the environment. But when it comes to the security team and using a tool to collect information, prioritize that information, and then dole out the remediation efforts, I think that it's great when you can use tools that play nicely with each other already. The automation that you want to build into that process is something that is built into the tool natively and doesn't require maintenance, which is a really big issue. So I want to linger on I guess the rough theme of the event, which is remote workers. The fact that with the events in the world in the last few months, we've seen a major adoption of our agent, as most companies are forced to adopt some form of remote workforce and remote work stance. And so with that, one thing I'll say is that while Insight VM is the tool that I have access to, and of course it's my job to advocate for Rapid7 technology, this mindset and what I want to talk about can be applied to other tools that are out there, even ones that you potentially already have. So Insight VM is, of course, there's a central console. You can scan with the console. You can scan with scan engines. As Jeff mentioned, that would be like an authenticated network scan. You can also deploy agents, and Jeff did a good job of hitting on the importance of an agent-based architecture, and we've seen a massive adoption of our agent in the last few months because the way the agent works is it runs as a service on the endpoint devices on the hosts and reports back to the console via the cloud. So it doesn't require a VPN. It only requires an internet connection and of course routability. And it's collecting this data. We do it every 6 hours, but the agents you can think of it as continuous, especially when compared to a network vulnerability scan that might be run every few weeks or once a month. And in our case, one of the coolest parts of this is two pieces. One is that it's a cross-platform agent, so it works with all of our tools, including our SIEM, but also that it is actually only collecting snapshots of the host. So it's collecting the data of the host, the registry, the file system, encrypting that, sending it back to the console where the console does the vulnerability attribution. And why that's important for entities or companies that have a large remote workforce, especially now, is I've seen companies that have a hard time expanding their VPN to provide coverage for every user. And so users are largely remaining off VPN unless required for certain job functions. And even if their asset is powered off, say someone gets furloughed, or say they decide to take, I don't know, vacation or sabbatical or something like that, and the asset's powered off and you don't have the ability to run a network-based vulnerability scan like Jeff mentioned, we still have their most recent snapshot, and we still can attribute new vulnerability coverage to the snapshot, even when the asset's not powered on or not reachable. So if we've got, say, a server cluster with critical information, and in fact, I was working with a customer this morning who has a wildly scaling server cluster in AWS, and they start and stop AWS instances as needed, and that could scale by the thousands, and sometimes those don't even get spooled up for a matter of months. Well, if those have been transient or have been turned off for months, and a 0-day comes out tomorrow, we can still tell you which of those assets are going to be exposed to that vulnerability, even when you haven't run an assessment on those hosts in 3 months. So that would be the collection piece. So I'd say getting data into the tool. Of course, you can collect vulnerabilities with the network scan. You can also use the agent. The other side of the coin here is just the inventory itself. Knowing what you have, CIS control number 1. And one of the ways that we can do that is with discovery connections. So we can connect to VMware, we can connect to Active Directory, AWS, DHCP is a common one. And what we're doing here is pulling in the inventory sources of truth, and these are live connections. So they're always going to be up to date. The new assets in AWS will automatically be populated. If you remove or deprovision assets in Active Directory, they'll be removed from the tool. And you can tag these assets upon ingestion. So, and I'll kind of hit on this a few times, but the tagging is important. Of course, it's a best practice in cloud environments. It's just generally a best practice to be able to divide up your assets and information in ways that are meaningful to you, especially when it comes to prioritizing information and taking action. And we can do that upon ingestion using these discovery connections. We can pre-tag the agent installer so that those tags are inherited on the asset as soon as they're discovered. Say you bake the agent into an OVA or into an AMI in Amazon. As soon as that asset is populated into Insight VM, it will incorporate these tags. And in an asset view, the way that that shows up is going to be in the fingerprint at the top. You'll see any tags that have been applied. Some of these are applied with manual tagging, and others are applied with the automated filtered asset search, we would call it. But the one that's unique here is the criticality tag. And Jeff mentioned that it's important to know which of your assets are business critical. If you have servers that, if they were to go down for any period of time, would hamstring the business. That's important to know, but also bake that into the tool. It doesn't make sense to use a tool like this one to collect all the data, only to pipe it out in a CSV and put it in a spreadsheet and sit around a conference table trying to figure out, which assets are common subnets and which solutions apply to multiple assets and how critical the assets are. You should be able to bake these kinds of things directly into the tool, and in this case, you can. And that criticality will modify the risk represented by an asset. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about briefly in terms of sectioning your data in ways that are meaningful is the use of groups, and in our case, filtered asset search. This can be really clever. I've seen some really, really clever uses of this. An easy example would be like software name contains Zoom. If you want to know what assets in your environment have Zoom, you have an auditing tool at your disposal, and you can use the auditing tool to solve problems that aren't necessarily only related to security. So if the IT team comes back and says, hey, we got to send the whole workforce remote, I need to know which assets don't have Zoom on them that are in the workforce or in the workstation group. You could create a search for that. You could add in like a service name that's running. You could add in an operating system. You could add in a port that's open. A lot of different common use cases here just to allow you to section off your data. Great one that I end up working with customers all the time on is going to be vulnerabilities assessed. So this would be not necessarily the discovery date of the asset or last time it was touched, but specifically when was the last time that I conducted a vulnerability assessment on this asset? And more specifically, I want to know any asset that I haven't conducted a vulnerability assessment for in the last 30 days. And I have, roughly half of my environment that I haven't scanned in the last 30 days. And these filters would be in alignment with your security policy. So if you say, work with Jeff and he says, hey, it's best practice to scan once a month, even if that's for policy, I want to be able to monitor the assets that aren't being scanned once a month. So I'll create an asset group that's like stale assets. And now if I were to go scan 1,000 of these assets today, tomorrow this group would only have 500 and change remaining because this group will automatically update. And between the tagging and the grouping, these are simply ways that you can allow the tool to do the work of sectioning off your data, even as you're scaling, whether that's remote or in the cloud. So all that being data ingestion and filtering, what it is that you're actually prioritizing based on. Jeff mentioned CVSS. Of course, this is here. There is a shift generally in the industry away from CVSS. I say not away from, but in addition to CVSS, because CVSS doesn't capture everything that entities like yourselves are trying to use to prioritize risk. In our case, we developed the risk score. It's between 1 and 1,000 for individual vulnerabilities. It's tied to CVSS because all of the vectors here are included in the risk score, as well as other dynamic factors that Jeff also mentioned, of course, like the age of the vulnerability, the popularity in the wild, the ease of exploitation, whether or not there's a malware kit associated with these items that could be used to make this easier to attack. If you're using Metasploit Pro, then you can actually pass these over to Metasploit Pro to have an ad hoc pen test conducted, in which case it will come back and say either validated with Metasploit or not exploitable. And that can be used to adjust the prioritization as well. At the asset level, this risk score aggregates higher, and I kind of pointed to this earlier, but the asset view is the sum of the risk scores on the asset. So this is the no kidding mathematical sum of all the vulnerabilities on this asset. And it's modified by the criticality tag again. So you've identified the clusters of your assets that are important, and that's automatically modifying the risk score so that you're not having to do this in some other tool or mechanism. Once you've created groups and potentially scan groups or asset clusters you care about, that concept continues rolling higher and higher. So from a programmatic standpoint, when you're trying to figure out where is the gravitational centers of risk, or are they in our environment, is our Amazon subset more or less risky than our Azure subset, or our remote workforce more or less risky than our on-premises servers, you can compare these together. And I think that's a good way to, from a systematic programmatic standpoint, I'd allocate resources, either time or funding, as well as be able to advocate for additional budget, which is not something that many people like to talk about, but it's very important to be able to advocate for your security program and to be able to quantifiably demonstrate the return on those investments. Now, this is cool from a CISP standpoint, putting your hat on and comparing risk is great, but from the end execution standpoint, from the user who's going to be actually mitigating these problems, this isn't too useful. However, the risk score is going to help with that as well. And the way that that's done is through, in part, reporting, of course, one of which that we use commonly is called the Top 25 Remediations Report. And this report is a little different from what most customers that I work with have run before. Most customers that I've worked with usually are ranking their vulnerabilities by their individual criticality, which of course leads to the problem of we have 1,000 high vulnerabilities and 10.5 thousand medium vulnerabilities, and it may take us, well, invariably we can never get through all the mediums, and so we just have to go top to bottom. What this report is doing is it's saying, okay, I get it, we have 5,000 and plus vulnerabilities, but what are the common solutions to those vulnerabilities? And if I add up and sum up the risk reduced by those vulnerabilities according to solution, I can rank the solutions by their risk reduction. So in this case, I've only run this report on 75 assets instead of the 4,000 that I have in my demo instance. And this could be an asset owner. It could be an individual user on your team. It could be an admin of some sort. It could be based on your focus areas that you've decided on strategically in your program. And the idea is to run this over a set of assets that you have the domain to affect. So am I able to mitigate risk across 4,000 assets? Probably not. I'm probably more responsible for only the Linux servers or something like that, or one geographic location. In that case, I'll filter this report on my location or assets that I own. And now I have a list of the things that I can be doing to be most time effective and resource effective in terms of mitigating risk. Really everywhere in the solution, we will provide the steps to implementation. So you get the download links to the patches, the KB numbers, the Linux commands, and the list of assets that those need to be completed for. So this is a distributable report, one of many that you could use. Those reports can be scheduled to be disseminated automatically. That could be either based on a time, or it could also be based on a scan running. If you're running scans every quarter and you don't have the agent deployed, it doesn't make sense to run a report every day. You run a report according to your remediation cadence, as well as your ability to conduct scans and get fresh data. So you could say, I want this to run after every scan. That way you don't worry about the calendar. You just let the scans run whenever they're running. That could be based on automated triggers, like a new threat definition is available. It could be a new asset discovered, or something like that. We do provide that in a calendar view. I don't know, I can't speak to other tools, but this is just a nice way to visualize what it is you've scheduled in your environment and keep tabs on that. Now, what I will say is I'm seeing a lot more of a shift towards the SOC mindset, towards the real-time site picture as opposed to the reporting. And of course, that's because as agents are getting rolled out, you actually do have a continuous stream of data coming into the tool. And so therefore you can visualize it in real time. And in our case, dashboards are reconfigurable, and you can add cards from the card library. You can delete cards. You can have as many dashboards as you need. And what I always tell individual users is, create yourself a custom dashboard that you like, that makes your job easier. The data is coming in automatically. It's being grouped automatically, tagged automatically, prioritized even. And I want to see this dashboard in a manner that's useful to me when it comes to reducing risk in the environment. And what that means in this case is I can grab any of these cards and apply filters to them. So this one, exploitable assets by skill level. I could load a query, and you know what I care about is Windows 10 assets. So I can, these are saved queries, but you can add custom filters here as well. So Windows 10 assets, risk score greater than or equal to 700. If this is valuable to me, then I can save this as a new card. And this would be high risk Win 10. And now my dashboard is going to have this card permanently filtered all the time. And you can see how that one differs from this one. Ways that this can be used at a programmatic level is you can actually have multiple rows that are each filtered to different geographic locations or subsets of the environment. And I think, Jeff, you actually had a couple examples of this in tiny screenshots on your slides, but great use here. Now, one of the cool cultural pieces of this, especially if you have good transparency and collaboration between your remediation teams and your security team, is you can use these dashboards to provide like office level visibility. And I don't know if you guys are doing this, Jeff, but I've worked with customers that had like a SOC account, and they would individually create these dashboards in their private user instance and then share these with their SOC account. And the SOC account's logged into a flat screen on the office wall. And so individual users can create slick dashboards that can then be shared to the flat screen. And I actually did have a team that had a fantasy VM like betting pool based on one of their dashboards, and they amongst the team had a little bit of a wager for something at the end of the year. But I digress. So that would be real-time monitoring. Jeff mentioned the importance of integrating with ticketing solutions. All that effort that you put into ingesting data, tagging it, grouping it, prioritizing it, applying the criticality, all that is designed to result in remediations. And in our case, we use projects to capture that. You can specify custom projects that are whatever scope you want. This could be like a Windows 10 effort on specific patches. It could be critical vulnerabilities. And those are captured in the form, again, of solutions, not of vulnerabilities. So in this case, this is the solution. You get the download link to the patch, et cetera. You get the assets that needs to be applied to, and we natively integrate with a number of ticketing integrations so that these are in real time. And in our case, those are bidirectional. So if I have a solution here, it's got associated, in this case, ServiceNow incident, and someone closes that incident, it actually will move the solution to awaiting verification. And hopefully that the next time a scan runs, that's gone, right? So, and that would get moved to closed. Projects are meant to be specifically scoped, achievable, objective, measurable objectives in the environment, things that you want to achieve, and could potentially be executable by one person. We do have the ability to measure programmatic metrics, and of course, having security policy, measuring your critical time to remediation, measuring your obsolete operating system migration. These are kinds of things you can also measure in the tool so that you're not having to generate, again, these things in a spreadsheet somewhere else. So kind of to summarize, I'd say the struggle with remote workforces is not one of the back end of the data manipulation, it's ingestion in the first place. So if you have deployed agents, especially if they operate on a snapshot architecture, if you have at least a VPN, if you don't have the ability to deploy agents, having a VPN out there, collecting that data in real time and doing your best to maintain currency of that data is of paramount importance, and connecting to your inventory systems. Once you've got it in there, using automated grouping and tagging and using automated prioritization to identify ahead of time programmatically with your teams ways that are things that are important to you, ways that you want to escalate certain pieces of information, and then using all of those to drive your reporting and dashboarding in ways that provide value and are measurable in terms of their remediation. At the very end, of course, you would have identified programmatic level objectives like this one, obviously operating systems being gone by a certain date, and measuring those as well, and checking in over a period of time, whether that's according to a compliance baseline or according to your own security policy. So I think that wraps it up. I know that was a kind of a whirlwind summary, but I'll turn it back over.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate the time and the input. And definitely Rapid7's been a wonderful partner for us to work with and help out many clients with your platform. So thank you so much. All right, we're going to transition over to Nathan Mondragon with vCORE Technology.
Thank you, Mark. If I may ask you to go to the next slide, please. I'd like to tell the team a bit about vCORE Technology Partners. We are a 10-year-old IT solutions and service provider based just down the road from MegaplanIT in Scottsdale. We have a footprint that spreads throughout the West, from Denver to Calgary to Honolulu. We focus primarily on the West, but many of our customers obviously have operations outside the West. We're not averse to operating west of or east of the Rockies. We have strong partner relationships that include over 200 OEMs. We are engineering-led. We have over 100 engineers with deep technology expertise, and our engineering to sales ratio is an extremely healthy 8-to-1. Although we have strong technology opinions, we're vendor independent. We will always put your best interest first when we make recommendations about technology solutions. Next slide, if you would, please, Mark. Our technology expertise is broad and spans the data center, including everything from storage, compute, hyperconverged infrastructure, and traditional network, the modern network, including firewalls, software-defined networking, and SD-WAN, and cloud services. Think automation services and DevOps. From a remediation perspective, we are really focused on helping with patching and assisting in a patching project all the way to patching as a service. Next slide, if you would, please, Mark. From a managed service perspective, our primary focus areas include enterprise NOC, identity management and Office 365, cloud operations, and the data center or systems management. And this is truly where our vulnerability remediation offerings take space. Our offerings are highly flexible and customizable. We can do what your business needs to free up IT ops to focus on non-patching related or vulnerability remediation items that are focused to the business. We do patching as a project, as a residency if needed, or as staff aug or managed services. And again, we have very flexible patching offerings. We can help you with patching everything from a server, Linux, or Windows to desktops as well. So as a tight partner with Rapid7 and MegaplanIT, we want you to think of vCORE as a vulnerability remediation extension of your team. And please leverage us or feel free to use us if we can help assist your IT operations team. Mark, back over to you.
Thank you, Nathan. I appreciate it. So we're going to transition now to our webinar featured speaker. So Stephanie, take it away.
Next slide, Mark. You know, one of the things that's not lost on most of the people that are on the call is complex environments. And so a number of us have environments where we have legacy systems that for whatever reason really belong in the trash can instead of a closet, but we're unable to change them due to applications that the organization is dependent on. We also have a number of different types of secured systems that are highly regulated. So in the gaming environment, we have the Nevada Gaming Control Board, for example, that is responsible for regulating systems that touch the gaming floor. But we also are required to be PCI compliant. We're a publicly traded company, so we have SOX. We actually have a variety of different type of healthcare and HR information. So we have HIPAA. And so there's a variety of different types of compliance that make our organization very complex, as well as the age of the systems. The role of the partners at that point becomes very critical, and that you are engaging with partners, not vendors. And the reason why is because as we look at these complex environments, and specifically in my experience here at Station Casinos, what we're seeing is that not a single solution or a single vendor can take and digest all of the different types of threat mitigation, risk and vulnerability management that we need to do. We have PCs, we have Macs, we have mainframes, we have mobile devices, we have wireless, we have all kinds of different things that make the environment complex. And then with that become some challenges, because finding the right solutions and the right partners and a way to be able to address the vulnerability landscape holistically becomes a challenge. And so as we look at partners, it's important to have manufacturers, service providers, and resellers all working together to the benefit of the organization. I happen to be lucky enough that when I joined Station Casinos, we had a security summit where we got a chance to vet the best in breed. So from a service provider perspective, vCORE is one of our key partners. From a security perspective, PCI, we use MegaplanIT. And then for vulnerability management and scanning, especially on the scanning side and with some of the new potential product, as well as interfacing with our help desk software and some other things, we use Rapid7. And so those tools together with the right service providers provide some very interesting results. When we look at the service model as the economy in Las Vegas has kind of taken that downturn because we were required to shut all of our casinos on March 17th. And so we have been closed that entire time with no revenue coming in. Clearly, without revenue coming in, there has to be some downsizing of environments. And so my staff was significantly downsized. And in order to still provide the organization vulnerability management, threat mitigation, PCI compliance, because we're still required to be PCI compliant, those types of services, such as scanning as a service, patching as a service, those kinds of services are required to make sure that as we are down, that those security needs are still being met, because they didn't go away. And so working with the partners to be able to do that is a key piece of it. The other key piece was, how do I send a whole workforce remote in 48 hours? And so a lot of us went through that challenge. Some of it was, let's just say, a little bumpy. However, the great thing is, with the solid partner relationships with hardware, software, services, and manufacturers, it made it very easy for us to be able to transition a very large number of our workforce over to remote users in that 48-hour time frame. And so for quite some time, 99% of all of our users were remote. Now the great news is we're getting ready to start to open. We have news from our governor that we're allowed to open on June 4th. So now we need to pull all this back together and make sure that we're still remediating everything that's necessary, as well as being able to drive value for our business as they come back online. And so putting all of the services together allow us to be able to take the pieces of the vulnerability management. And so on the Rapid7 side, clear down to auditing, the auditing tools, being able to identify the highest risks, the most vulnerable risks, the areas that we need to focus on, as well as making sure that when things get spun up into production, that they're current. I would love to say that all new images are all current and patched 100% and ready to go when they go into the environment. But those of us that work on the ground floor know that that's not necessarily true. And so this gives a chance for our agile teams to be able to use this tool to ensure that what they're putting out in production day one in a new environment is completely up to our standard, as well as then leveraging this tool to drive a lot of just-in-time needed vulnerability management. So, and really what it comes down to is what success looks like. So success looks like me reducing my threat score week after week because we scan weekly. Success looks like driving my overall remediation requirement down over time to the point where we're in just-in-time scenarios. And success looks like being able to truly execute on 0-day, being able to identify what other devices, for whatever reason, weren't caught in a 0-day patching upgrade, and make sure that we get those, or when those machines come online that we're able to do that. And then being able to work with the partners. If I'm unable or my teams are unable to patch or do vulnerability management or scanning of assets appropriately, that I have a partner network inside of vCORE and inside of MegaplanIT IT to be able to work out, can they augment those services while I'm still down several headcount in my area, to make sure that we maintain the most secure environment as possible. And so, Mark, success to me really looks like that score continuing to go down. As still part of our organizational objectives is for us to deliver a significantly lower to a 45% lower threat score than we did as of January 1. And so we're continuing to work through that. And it's through partners and great tools that we're able to do that.
Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate the input, the feedback, the real life perspective, right, of trying to make this work in stations, and we definitely appreciate your ongoing partnership. So from a takeaway perspective, we're in this together, and that's no more, it's more true now than it always or it ever was. So, you know, from a takeaway perspective, we want you to find and leverage a trusted security partner that will work with you on, you know, right sizing services to your organization's biggest challenges. So that's something that we pride ourselves at MegaplanIT on, is making sure we're actually helping solving the real problems and bringing the right technologies, services, and skill sets to do that across managed security, pen testing, and compliance. And then we want you to leverage the most innovative vendors like Rapid7, who continually evolve their tools and their entire platforms. And the integration of those tools, if you are interested in, you know, pen testing tools versus vulnerability scanning tools versus, you know, SIM tools, et cetera, right? You're going to find the most innovative vendors are really integrating those pieces where orchestration and automation and efficiency is really going to make a difference as you scale up in large environments. So definitely take advantage of the most innovative vendors. And then also, wherever you need help from a technology service provider standpoint, as far as mean time to resolve issues, and taking advantage of partners like vCORE from network, compute, backup, virtualization, patching, configuration, even technology refresh efforts. So definitely take advantage of all of the partners that are here today. And we are in this together, and we will move forward together. So again, thank you for your time. We will provide an update on the iPad giveaway to the selected participant and attendee of the event. So congratulations to them. We will be following up with them directly. And again, thank you for your time today. Mark Butler on behalf of MegaplanIT. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Steph. Thank you, Nathan. And thank you, Jeff, for the awesome input and feedback during this time. And we appreciate you joining us today for helping solve your biggest security roadblocks. Thank you. Take care.